Thank you so much for joining me today as we look at the timeline of the Tudor Dynasty. This journey will take several podcasts as their reign lasted 118 years. Today, we'll start from the beginning. The Tudor Dynasty began on August 22, 1485, when the army of Henry Tudor defeated that of King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry's coronation took place in Westminster Abbey on October 30th, 1485. On January 18th, 1486, King Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Both Elizabeth and Henry grew up during the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were battles between cousins. The House of Lancaster, the Red Rose, and the House of York, the White Rose. They each believed they had a right to the throne of England, since King Henry VI seemed incapable of handling his duties as king. When Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, they essentially ended the Wars of the Roses by uniting the two houses, just like the Tudor Rose does. The Tudor Rose was created in the reign of King Henry VII. As you notice when looking at it, there is a smaller white rose set inside a larger red rose. Elizabeth of York gave birth to a son, Arthur, on November 20th, 1487 at Winchester. This location was chosen because it is where his father, the king, wanted him to be born. The reason behind choosing Winchester was because Henry VII, who wanted his son to be named after the legendary King Arthur, wished him to be born at the capital of Camelot, which is considered to be present-day Winchester. On the 25th of November, 1487, Elizabeth of York was finally crowned Queen of England at Westminster. Some believe that Henry VII intentionally delayed her coronation because she held a stronger claim to the English throne. If he was crowned sometime before her, then there would be no question that he was the reigning monarch. This does make me wonder, had Elizabeth not become pregnant with Arthur so soon into their marriage, would she have been crowned much earlier? The marriage uniting the two houses did not stop others like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck from attempting to claim the throne as a York heir. 2 years later, on November 28, 1489, the king and queen welcomed a daughter, Margaret. Margaret would later go on to marry the King of Scotland. They would have a son, James V, who would have a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. On June 28, 1491, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York welcomed a son, Henry, at Greenwich. We know him best as King Henry VIII, the king who had 6 wives and beheaded 2 of them. Henry would go on to have 3 legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. All would later become ruling monarchs, but Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, is best remembered for her long and glorious reign. You know her as Queen Elizabeth I. Only a year later, on June 8, 1492, the Queen's mother, Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, died. The Queen was unable to attend her mother's funeral because she was near the end of her pregnancy. Only a month later, on July 2nd, she gave birth to a second daughter at Richmond, and she was called Elizabeth. One is to assume she was named after the Queen's mother. Unfortunately, the child would die from atrophy on September 14, 1495. She was only 3 years and 2 months old. 6 months after the death of their daughter Elizabeth, the Queen, who had been pregnant when young Elizabeth died, gave birth to a third daughter, Mary Rose, on March 18, 1496. Mary would go on to marry King Louis XII of France, and then Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. Through her descendants would rise the 9-day Queen, Lady Jane Grey. 7 long years later, at 33 years old, Elizabeth of York gave birth to a third son on February 22, 1499. They named him Edmund. Edmund, unfortunately, did not survive long. He died at only 4 months old. At the beginning of the 16th century, Prince Arthur, the oldest child of the King and Queen of England, who was also heir to the throne, married the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. Their wedding took place on November 16th, 1501 at St. Paul's Church in London. Sadly, the marriage would be short-lived. Arthur died on April 2nd, 1502 at Ludlow, where he had been living with his wife Catherine. 2 days after his death, a messenger arrived at Greenwich to inform the king and queen of the death of their son. It was decided that the king's confessor would tell him alone. When Henry VII found out about his son's passing, he was stunned and immediately sent for his wife. When Elizabeth saw the state of grief her husband was in, she did her best to comfort him by reminding him that they had more children, including another son, Henry. She also reminded him that they were both still young enough to have more children, especially another son. Elizabeth was 36 years old when Arthur died. By today's standards, not too old to have children, but by the standards of the early 16th century, she was nearing the end of her childbearing years. Elizabeth then explained to her husband that God had taken their son for a reason. The king thanked her for her soothing words, and Elizabeth returned to her apartments. It was when she returned to her rooms that she fell apart, just as any mother would after the loss of a child. When her ladies saw the extreme grief that the queen was in, they knew to call for the king to comfort her. It did not take long for Elizabeth of York to become pregnant again, and she and Henry had hoped for a son. On February 2nd, 1503, the queen gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, named after her daughter-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. Neither Elizabeth nor her daughter would survive, dying on February 11th from childbed fever. It was her 37th birthday. The baby died only a week later. Henry and their children grieved deeply for the loss of the queen. Henry assigned his mother and some officers to organize the funeral. He then went by boat to Richmond and locked himself away for quite some time to mourn privately. His actions lead us to believe that he deeply loved his wife. That same year, the king's son Henry, future Henry VIII, was betrothed to his former sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. And his daughter Margaret married James IV of Scotland, making her Queen of Scotland and a strong ally for England. It wasn't until February of 1504 that young Prince Henry was declared Prince of Wales. It had been nearly 2 years since his brother's death. We'll jump forward a bit in time to April 21st, 1509, and the death of King Henry VII at Richmond Palace. His son, Henry, Prince of Wales, was proclaimed king the following day on St. George's Day. In June of the same year, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, and they were both crowned at the same time 13 days later. 5 days into their coronation, the king's grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, died. By all accounts, it appears that Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were happy and in love. On New Year's Day 1511, Queen Catherine gave birth to a son. He would be called Henry, Duke of Cornwall. His birth was greatly celebrated by his parents and the kingdom, for England and Henry had an heir. Sadly, the prince would only live for 52 short days. This blurb from Hall's Chronicle discusses the Queen taking to her birthing chamber, and that is the reason why the king spent Christmas at Richmond Palace. It says that upon the new year the Queen gave birth to a prince, which caused great celebrations in the realm. It goes on to discuss the preparation for the christening as well. Here is the quote from Hall's Chronicle. It is to be noted that at this time the Queen was great with child, and shortly after this pastime she took to her chamber at Richmond, for which is the cause the king kept Christmas there. And on New Year's Day, the first day of January, the Queen was delivered of a prince, to the great gladness of the realm, for the honor of whom fires were made and many vessels of wine set for such as would take to certain streets in London. Little Prince Hal's christening was 4 days after his birth. Why? I'm not sure. I'm assuming it took time to put together such a grand ceremony, and they felt he was a healthy child, so it would be okay to have a delay in the christening. Here's another excerpt from Hall's Chronicle. After this great joy came sorrowful chance, for the young prince, which was born upon New Year's Day last past, upon the 12th day of February, being then the eve of St. Matthew's, departed this world at Richmond, and from there was carried to Westminster and buried. The king, like a wise prince, took this dolorous chance wondrous wisely, and the more to comfort the queen. He hid the matter, and made no great mourning outwardly, but the queen, like a natural woman, made much lamentation, howbeit by the king's good persuasion and behavior, her sorrow was mitigated, but not shortly. It took many more years for Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon to have a surviving child. Her name was Mary, and she was born in 1516. She would go on to be the first Queen Regnant of England. Thank you so much for joining me today, and check back for future podcasts that will continue this story.